Nintendo's mascot is Mario, and Sega has Sonic. But what about Sony? If you were around during the 32-bit era, you probably would have said Crash Bandicoot, and I would agree. At the time, Crash Bandicoot became the mascot-driven platformer that we all thought a first-party developer needed to survive in the gaming industry. However, there is one huge difference between Crash and his rivals. The Crash Bandicoot games were Western developed. While Mario and Sonic were developed in-house by Nintendo and Sega respectively, Crash Bandicoot was developed by Naughty Dog, a studio based in California. Now, Sony did actually own Naughty Dog, but it became clear that Crash wasn't the irrevocable representative of the Sony brand some of us had thought when he started appearing on rival consoles. With Crash Bandicoot 4, development was handed over to the UK-based Traveller's Tales, and the game was released simultaneously on the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube. Crash was no longer a Sony exclusive. But even before the birth of Crash Bandicoot, Sony of Japan once attempted to create a mascot character that could go toe-to-toe with Nintendo's beloved plumber. Hermie Hopperhead. Hermie Hopperhead is a 2D platformer released on the PlayStation 1 in 1995, and was clearly an attempt at recreating the kind of success Nintendo had with Mario. The game starts with an animated sequence where you meet the main character, Hermie, as he merrily runs through a junkyard. While waiting for a rendezvous with his girlfriend, Hermie falls down into a garbage can and ends up in an alternate world which he must traverse to get back to his own world. That's all the story you'll get for the entire game. The artwork tries to evoke American comics and even has the characters speaking English, although it's kept nearly inaudible for some reason. The game immediately evokes Super Mario World and starts you out on a world map where you can choose which level to enter. Of course, you'll have no choice but to enter level 1 when you start out. Hermie Hopperhead is a pretty straightforward Mario clone. You generally move left to right to reach a goal, and your primary method of attack is jumping on top of enemies, all of which are things you would expect to find in a garbage can. There are old shoes, empty cans, thumbtacks, and even angry tires. In a thinly veiled attempt to differentiate itself from Mario, you collect stars instead of coins, the function of which I'll get to later. Levels are mostly made up of above-ground and underground areas. Instead of pipes, you transport between them through trash cans. There are trash cans strewn all over the place in every level, some you just bounce off of, but some reveal a secret entrance indicated by the lid falling off partially once you've jumped on them. Then hopping on them again will take you to a different area of the level. Many levels contain several branches and 2 different exits, which open up different pathways on the world map and allow you to access different levels depending on which exit you took. So even though Hermie Hopperhead is indeed a run-and-jump platformer, there's also a hint of exploration to it, as most hardcore gamers who want to clear the game with 100% will spend their time looking for every exit in the branching levels. And as you would expect, areas leading to a second exit are often much more difficult or require some kind of trick like finding and pressing a switch to open the path to. Thankfully, Hermie isn't completely alone. The feature of the game touted most loudly on the packaging is the inclusion of helper animals that you can find and raise. Sometimes in levels you'll come across different colored eggs that will follow you if you touch them, up to 3 at a time. At the end of each level you get a screen where you can hand out the stars you've collected to these eggs, which will then grow into animals at predetermined star amounts. There's a turtle, a chicken, a penguin, and the coveted dragon, whose eggs appear infrequently. The sight of these little characters following Hermie around will probably bring another game to mind for most gamers. The idea is suspiciously similar to the eggs that follow Mario around in Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island. Although, Hermie Hopperhead was released only 1 month after Yoshi's Island, so it's hard to say they ripped off the idea. Usually, the helpers will just follow you, but pressing the triangle button will allow them to act on their own, during which time they'll go pick up stars and attack enemies. Well, maybe. The AI isn't too bright. Most of the time they just hop around aimlessly and will often fall into pits. What you'll mostly be using them for is creating platforms to otherwise inaccessible areas. Sometimes you'll find a sign with a picture of your eggs, and if you press the triangle button in front of it, they will turn into platforms that lead to some higher ledge. Some of these signs are hidden as well. You just have to walk over the ground for them to appear, and these tend to lead to the second exit within the level. Every once in a while, you'll come across a red trash can that will take you to a bonus stage. These bonus stages take place in a 3D space where you can run around picking up stars before the time limit runs out. I definitely get the feeling that these areas were added as a way of crossing off the checkbox for needs to have polygons that existed in programmers' minds at the time, possibly in hope of getting Sony of America's approval for a localized release. We all know how that worked out. Supposedly, if you can clear every one of the bonus levels perfectly with all the stars, you'll get some kind of Easter egg, but I've never found anyone who's done it or says specifically what happens. There isn't even a perfect playthrough on Nico Nico Douga. Every world contains a boss, indicated by a square on the world map as opposed to a circle. Although, you don't necessarily have to fight every boss, due to the branching paths circumventing them in some worlds. Basically, it's a Mario-inspired platformer that wouldn't have been out of place in the early days of the PS1 had 2D games not been filtered so relentlessly from the Western market. Nearly 25 years later, we all know that Hermie Hopperhead did not, in fact, become Sony's mascot, or achieve anywhere near the level of success any Mario game had. So why is that? Well, there are some obvious issues with the game. The very first thing I'm willing to bet any gamer will notice is the extreme sensitivity of the jump control. Hermie has essentially no forward momentum. Every millimeter of horizontal movement must be input with impeccable precision. This is exacerbated times 1000 when you realize that the hit detection for jumping on top of enemies is harsher than any other 2D platformer with the same mechanic I can think of. You have a tiny amount of space to safely land on an enemy. Being just a bit to the side will be the death of you. Thankfully, if you have any helpers with you, taking a hit will simply release them from your control, and in most cases you can easily grab them back. It's pretty clear this was implemented because even the most experienced of gamers won't be able to land in the 2mm hitbox of enemies more than 80% of the time. In the beginning, the jump momentum will seem completely untamable, but if you're patient, you'll discover that it can be mastered, and the extremely precise jumps required in some of the underground areas are indeed possible. I was rather disappointed to discover that Hermie Hopperhead effectively has only 2 songs, one for outdoors and one for when you're underground. These are both excellent songs that I find myself humming long after finishing the game, and the main outdoor theme has several variations, but when you get down to it, 2 songs. Now, to be fair, Super Mario 1 and 2 also had 2 level songs, and it wasn't a problem at all. But I think most gamers will expect more from a PlayStation game, especially considering how most developers were trying to get as much as they could from the relatively new CD technology. As for your little animal friends, they actually end up being more of a burden than anything. If one falls in a pit and you accidentally touch another egg, you'll lose one of your previous helpers, and it takes many play sessions to get them evolved to their strongest form, so when this happens you'll probably just have to reset the game. And in a couple sections where there's lava that will kill them instantly, this gets frustrating. The one area where they become indispensable is the underwater levels. There seems to be a consensus that underwater levels in platformers are largely crap, but the ones in Hermie Hopperhead may honestly be the worst of all time. The enemies are much more effective swimmers than Hermie, so you have no choice but to release your helpers and just pray that they connect with the enemies before you get hit. However, doing so means that you're now in one-hit death mode. And if you're having a hard time imagining what that's like, I'll tell you. Annoying as fuck. As for the rest of the levels, they're fine. The level design is not bad, but it's rarely great. If you're not concerned about opening up every single level on the world map and getting 100%, you can dash through most levels without much thought. There are some moving platforms and swinging maces here and there, but I certainly wouldn't call any of it groundbreaking. World 3 was by far my favorite. It has you in a sort of amusement park with lots of moving platforms that look like horses on a carousel and Ferris wheels to cross. The few levels that try something new are nice, but the graphical style and stage themes are lacking in variety and, for lack of a better term, monotonous. There are some exceptions like the ice stages, but more than half of the game takes place in nondescript forest stages, and the underground areas are almost all the same. Also, enemy placement wasn't done very skillfully. It's like they just randomly slapped a bunch of enemies on the environments, who incessantly wander back and forth, and since it's so hard to jump on them consistently, you're bound to take a hit eventually. And the bosses were so obviously tacked on at the end just because every platformer needs to have bosses. I am not exaggerating when I say they are embarrassingly simple. The boss of World 1 literally just throws a couple waves of minor enemies at you and disappears. That's it. Now, I've just spent quite a bit of time going over this game's faults, and they're undeniable, but my final verdict on the game is, I absolutely loved it. That may come as a bit of a surprise considering everything I just said, but seriously, once I started playing with the intent of beating it, I was hooked. It was probably the only thing I played for a good 3 weeks. The reason is simple. Finding the secret exits and opening up new levels is just fun. Discovering a hidden signpost or using your helpers to pull open a cork and reveal a new section of the level was satisfying enough to keep me playing. Of course, I'm partial to 2D games, and the playful background music certainly helped, but Hermie Hopperhead is actually fulfilling once you get accustomed to the wonky jump control. It may just be a long series of low-level dopamine hits as you work your way to getting 100%, but I don't see anything wrong with that. And even though it's completely accidental, the simplistic level design combined with the problematic hit detection do end up making the difficulty level just right. Playing Hermie Hopperhead made me think that the game had a decent budget, but the developers didn't have much experience in making 2D action games. And the Japanese Wikipedia article about the game says just that. The main programmers had lots of experience coding, but not in game design. So what we got was a game that is nice, but does nothing to differentiate itself from the legions of other games in the genre. Even so, I think more retro lovers should give Hermie Hopperhead a chance. With a couple tweaks and a better PR campaign, it could have become a name we recognize just as easily as Mario or Sonic. Just imagine, in some alternate universe, there's a corny live-action movie with the Hermie characters being made. The trailer gets released, and the entire internet complains and moans about how it looks like total garbage for absolutely no reason.